The inheritance came with more than just the keys to my grandmother's beach house in Outer Banks. It came with a warning I should have heeded. "Don't go out after midnight when the fog rolls in," my grandmother had whispered on her deathbed, her weathered fingers gripping mine with surprising strength. "And whatever you do, don't look for the light in the dunes." I dismissed it as the rambling of a dying woman, but standing on the wraparound porch 3 months later, watching the Atlantic stretch endlessly before me, those words echoed in my mind. The house sat on stilts, weathered cedar shingles gray from decades of salt spray, surrounded by tall seagrass that whispered secrets in the constant wind. I'd come here to write, to finish the novel that had been haunting me for 2 years. The isolation seemed perfect. No neighbors for miles, just the rhythm of waves and crying gulls. The nearest town was 40 minutes by car, accessible only by a single winding road through the maritime forest. The first few days passed peacefully. I settled into a routine. Coffee on the porch at sunrise, writing until noon, long walks on the beach in the afternoon. The house had been modernized over the years, but it still retained that old coastal charm: shiplap walls, nautical fixtures, and windows that framed the ocean like living paintings. On the 4th night, the fog came. I was editing in the living room, laptop balanced on my knees, when I noticed the temperature drop. The windows began to fog, and within minutes, a thick gray blanket had swallowed the world outside. I could barely see the deck railing, let alone the beach beyond. That's when I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a boat's beacon, but it was too steady, too close to shore. It appeared to be moving slowly through the dunes, maybe 100 yards from the house. A soft, amber glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, despite my grandmother's warning echoing in my head. The fog was so thick I could taste it, and the usual sound of waves seemed muffled, distant. My flashlight beam disappeared after just a few feet. I followed the wooden boardwalk that led from the house to the beach, using the handrails to guide me. The light seemed to be getting closer, or maybe I was moving toward it. In the fog, it was impossible to tell. Then I heard it, a low, mournful humming, like a lullaby sung by the wind itself. My foot hit sand, and I realized I'd reached the beach. The light was directly ahead now, maybe 50 feet away. As I watched, a figure emerged from the fog, tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like a long coat that flapped in a breeze I couldn't feel. The figure was facing the ocean, and in its hands was an old-fashioned lantern, the source of the amber glow. It stood perfectly still, like a statue, except for the gentle swaying of the lantern. "Hello!" I called out, my voice swallowed by the fog. The figure slowly turned toward me, and my blood turned to ice. Where its face should have been was nothing but shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the ocean itself. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The figure began to move toward me with a gliding motion, as if its feet weren't quite touching the sand. The lantern's glow grew brighter, and in its light, I could see dozens of other figures emerging from the fog along the shoreline. All tall, all wearing the same long coats, all carrying lanterns. They formed a line between me and the house. Panic seized me. I turned and ran parallel to the shore, hoping to circle around them. But everywhere I looked, more figures appeared, their lanterns creating a constellation of amber lights in the gray void. The humming grew to a roar, like the sound of a massive ship's engine. Then I heard my grandmother's voice, clear as if she were standing beside me. "The tide pools behind the house. Follow the shell path." I'd forgotten about the tide pools, rocky formations on the north side of the property that created small lagoons at low tide. I'd walked past them several times but never paid much attention. Now, feeling along the base of the dunes, I found the narrow shell path my grandmother had mentioned. The figures seemed to lose interest as I moved away from the main beach. Their lights grew dimmer, their humming quieter. I followed the path through the seagrass until I reached the rocky outcroppings. There, hidden among the pools, was a small cave I'd never noticed, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside, I found candles, matches, and a leather journal wrapped in oilcloth. My grandmother's journal. The pages were filled with entries dating back 50 years, all describing the same phenomenon. The fog, the lights, the figures with their lanterns. They're not malevolent, one entry read. They're searching for something lost to the sea long ago, but they can't tell the difference between the living and the dead. If they take you into the water, you become one of them. A tide watcher, forever searching, forever lost. I spent the rest of the night in that cave, reading by candlelight. The journal told of a merchant ship that had wrecked offshore in 1847, its crew and passengers lost in a storm. They'd been trying to reach the lighthouse that once stood where my grandmother's house now sat, but the light had failed them. As dawn approached, the fog began to lift. I emerged from the cave to find the beach empty, the only evidence of the night's events the dozens of strange circular impressions in the sand where the figures had stood. I left that morning the novel forgotten, but sometimes, on foggy nights no matter where I am, I hear that distant humming and see amber lights in the mist, and I know that somewhere on that lonely stretch of beach, they're still searching, still waiting for someone foolish enough to follow their light into the tide. The house still stands empty. I've had offers to sell it, but I can't bring myself to let someone else face what lives in those dunes. My grandmother's warning wasn't the rambling of a dying woman. It was the wisdom of someone who'd spent 50 years keeping the tide watchers at bay. Some inheritances come with a price that can never be paid. Marcus thought he'd found the perfect remote work setup when he agreed to house-sit his cousin's beach rental in Monterey Bay. The place was a sleek, modern structure perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, all glass and steel angles that seemed to grow from the rock itself. His cousin had warned him about the internet being spotty during storms, but Marcus worked in cybersecurity. He could handle a few connectivity issues. What he couldn't handle was what he discovered on the third night. The house had a state-of-the-art security system with cameras covering every angle of the property. Marcus had been given access to monitor things while his cousin was traveling in Europe. It was mostly routine. Checking the feeds showed nothing but fog rolling in from the ocean, the occasional deer wandering through the yard, seabirds perched on the deck railings. But on Wednesday night, Camera 4, the one facing the beach access trail, picked up something unusual. Marcus was working late, debugging code for a client, when his secondary monitor chimed with a motion alert. He glanced over expecting to see another deer or maybe a raccoon. Instead, he saw a person standing perfectly still at the edge of the camera's range. The figure was barely visible in the night vision feed, just a pale silhouette against the dark backdrop of Monterey pines. What made Marcus pause was how motionless they were. Not the natural shifting of someone looking around or walking, absolutely statue still. He switched to the adjacent camera to get a better angle, but Camera 5 showed only empty forest. When he switched back to Camera 4, the figure was gone. Marcus replayed the footage. The timestamp showed the figure had stood there for exactly 7 minutes and 33 seconds without moving. Then, between one frame and the next, they simply vanished. No walking away, no ducking out of sight, just there, then not there. He checked the other cameras, scrubbing through the footage from the same time period. Nothing. It was as if the person had teleported to that exact spot, stood motionless for 7.5 minutes, then disappeared. The next night, it happened again. Same camera, same duration, same impossible stillness. This time, Marcus was ready. He grabbed binoculars and went out onto the deck, but the night was too dark to see anything beyond the reach of the security lights. By the fifth night, Marcus had identified a pattern. The figure appeared at exactly 2:17 a.m., stood motionless until 2 hours 24 minutes and 33 seconds, then vanished. Always the same duration, always the same behavior. He started taking screenshots, documenting everything. That's when he noticed something disturbing in the metadata. According to the camera's internal clock, the appearances weren't happening at 2:17 a.m. They were happening at 3:17 a.m. But Marcus's computer, his phone, and every other device in the house showed 2:17. It was as if the figure existed 1 hour ahead of real time. Marcus called his cousin in Prague, waking him up at an ungodly hour. "David, I need to ask you something about the house." Have you ever noticed anything strange with the security system? Strange how? David's voice was groggy but alert. The timestamps, motion detection. Have you ever seen someone on the cameras who shouldn't be there? A long silence. Then, Marcus, I'm going to send you an email. Don't open it until you're ready to pack up and leave. And when you do leave, don't look back. Don't check the cameras from your phone. Just go. The email arrived 10 minutes later. The subject line read, "You're the fourth person to ask about camera 4. Marcus stared at his laptop screen, cursor hovering over the message. Part of him wanted to delete it, to pretend this conversation had never happened. But he'd always been the type who needed to know, who couldn't leave a mystery unsolved. He opened the email. Marcus, the first renter who mentioned the figure was Dr. Sarah Chun, a marine biologist. She documented 17 consecutive nights of appearances. On the 18th night, she disappeared. Her car was found in the driveway, her laptop still open, security footage showing her walking toward camera 4's location at 2:17 a.m. She never came back. The second was Jake Martinez, a graduate student. He made it 23 nights before he couldn't resist investigating. Same thing, walked out to where the figure stands, never returned. The third was Emma Kowalski, a software engineer like you. She lasted the longest 31 nights. She was convinced she could solve it, kept talking about temporal anomalies and quantum entanglement. Her final email to me was one line, "I understand now. It's not showing us the past or the future. It's showing us what we become." The police investigated each disappearance. No evidence of foul play, no bodies found, no explanation. I should have told you, but I needed someone to watch the house, and I thought maybe if you didn't know, it wouldn't happen to you. I was wrong. The figure appears for 7 minutes and 33 seconds because that's how long it takes to walk from the house to the cliff edge. I've timed it myself. And the 1-hour time discrepancy? That's how long it takes for a body to be carried out to sea by the current. Don't go outside after 2 a.m. Don't try to investigate. Just leave. I'm sorry, David. Marcus read the email 3 times, his hands shaking. He looked at the security monitor. It was 1:47 a.m. Every logical part of his mind told him to pack immediately, to be in his car and driving away before 2:17. But the engineer in him, the problem solver, couldn't let it go. He had 30 minutes to figure this out. He pulled up all the footage from the past week, analyzing frame by frame. The figure's posture, the exact position, the way the shadows fell. Everything was identical. It wasn't just the same person returning to the same spot. It was the same moment, replaying over and over. At 2:15, Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. He grabbed a flashlight and walked outside. The night was clear, stars reflected on the calm ocean below. Marcus followed the trail toward camera 4's location, his flashlight beam dancing across the path. At exactly 2:17, he reached the spot where the figure always appeared. Nothing happened. Marcus stood there, waiting, feeling foolish. The camera was 30 feet away, a red LED blinking steadily. He waved at it, knowing he'd see himself on the footage later. Then 2 hours, 24 minutes, and 33 seconds arrived, and everything changed. The world lurched sideways, reality fracturing like a broken mirror. Marcus found himself standing in the exact same spot, but the landscape around him was different. The house was gone, replaced by old-growth forest. The cliff face showed signs of recent collapse, and below, the ocean was choked with debris. Wooden planks, barrel staves, the broken mast of a ship, and standing beside him, translucent and shimmering, were 3 other figures. A woman in a lab coat with Drive S. Chun embroidered on the pocket. A young man in a university sweatshirt. A woman with short-cropped hair wearing a software company t-shirt. They all turned to look at him with eyes that held infinite sadness. "We tried to warn you," Sarah Chun whispered, her voice carrying across decades. "We all tried to resist, but the timeline is fixed. This moment, our moment, it's a scar in time itself." Marcus understood now. The ship below, the collapsed cliff, the impossible repeating loop. They were all connected to some tragedy that had torn a hole in reality, and they were trapped in it, doomed to replay their final moments forever. "How long?" he asked. "Time doesn't work the same way here," Jake Martinez replied. "Sometimes it feels like minutes, sometimes like centuries, but eventually you'll understand that you were always meant to be here, that you were always here." As the vision faded and Marcus found himself back in the present, he realized the terrible truth. He wasn't seeing ghosts or temporal anomalies. He was seeing himself caught in a loop that had already happened, was happening, and would always happen. At 2:17 a.m. the next night, Camera 4 would show 5 figures standing motionless in the darkness. Marcus walked back to the house, but he knew he'd never really leave. Somewhere in the space between seconds, in the gap between one timeline and another, he would always be standing on that cliff, waiting for the next person curious enough to solve the mystery. The pattern would continue. It always had. When I first saw the Victorian beach house on Kiowa Island, I knew I had to have it. After months of working remotely from cramped city apartments, the idea of writing my dissertation while overlooking salt marshes and tidal creeks seemed like paradise. The rental listing had been oddly specific, perfect for solo retreats, ideal for writers and artists seeking inspiration. Previous guests have found the environment incredibly productive. What it didn't mention was Mrs. Cordelia Marsh. The house belonged to her family, built in 1887 by her great-great-grandfather, a shipping merchant who'd made his fortune in the cotton trade. Mrs. Marsh was 93, sharp as a tack, and lived in the carriage house behind the main property. She'd be available if I needed anything, the listing said, but would respect my privacy. I arrived on a sultry October afternoon, Spanish moss dripping from ancient oaks, the air thick with the smell of pluff mud and salt. The house was magnificent. 3 stories of gingerbread trim and wraparound porches, painted in soft blue-gray that had faded to the color of storm clouds. Mrs. Marsh met me at the front door, tiny and bird-like, wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. Her silver hair was pinned in an elegant chignon, and her blue eyes held a sharpness that made me feel like she was cataloging everything about me. "Dr. Rebecca Torres," she said before I could introduce myself, "pursuing your doctorate in Southern Gothic literature. How delightfully appropriate." She showed me through the house, pointing out original features: heart pine floors, hand-carved mantels, stained glass windows that threw jeweled light across the walls. My room was on the 2nd floor, a spacious suite with a canopy bed and French doors opening onto a balcony that overlooked the marsh. "I do hope you'll find everything you need," Mrs. Marsh said, her voice carrying a faint Charleston drawl. The house has always been particularly inspiring for those pursuing intellectual endeavors. That first evening, I set up my laptop in the sunroom off the main parlor. The space was perfect, windows on 3 sides, comfortable furniture, excellent lighting. As the sun set over the water, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold, I felt more motivated than I had in months. I was deep into a chapter on Flannery O'Connor when I heard the piano. The music was faint but clear, something classical, played with the kind of technical precision that spoke of years of training. I assumed Mrs. Marsh was enjoying an evening of music in the carriage house, though it seemed unusually loud to carry this far. When I mentioned it the next morning over coffee on the porch, Mrs. Marsh tilted her head curiously. "I'm afraid I haven't played piano in 20 years, dear. Arthritis, you know. But how lovely that you heard music. The house does have such wonderful acoustics." That night, the piano playing resumed at exactly 9:47 p.m. This time, I paid closer attention. The music was coming from inside the main house, somewhere on the 1st floor. I crept downstairs, following the sound to the formal parlor. The room was empty, moonlight streaming through lace curtains. But in the corner sat an antique grand piano, its keys moving by themselves, producing the haunting melody I'd been hearing. The bench was positioned as if someone were sitting there, the pedals depressing in rhythm with the music. I stood transfixed, watching invisible fingers dance across the keys. The piece was complex, melancholy, something that reminded me of Chopin but darker, more sorrowful. After exactly 12 minutes, the music stopped. The keys fell silent, the pedals released, and the piano became just another piece of furniture. The next morning, I asked Mrs. Marsh about the piano. Oh yes, that belonged to Evangeline Beaumont. Such a gifted girl. She stayed here in 1923, working on her musical compositions. Terribly tragic what happened to her. What happened? Mrs. Marsh's expression grew distant. She was found one morning at the piano, slumped over the keys. Heart failure, the doctor said, though she was only 26. Some say she played herself to death, consumed by her art. Her final composition was found on the music stand, the most beautiful, heartbreaking piece you ever heard. That evening, I positioned myself in the parlor before 9:47, determined to experience the phenomenon more directly. As the phantom music began, I noticed details I'd missed before. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The air seemed to shimmer around the piano, as if heat waves were rising from the keys. And most unnervingly, I could see a faint impression in the piano bench, the suggestion of a slight figure in a 1920s dress. For 12 minutes, I watched Evangeline Beaumont's ghost pour her soul into music that had died with her nearly a century ago. But she wasn't the only guest who'd never left. On my fourth night, I encountered Harrison Thorne. I was researching in the library, a cozy room lined with first editions and leather-bound volumes, when I noticed one of the books was open on the reading table. I was certain I'd left the room empty, all books properly shelved. The open book was a collection of Edgar Allan Poe, turned to The Fall of the House of Usher. In the margin, someone had written notes in faded ink, analyzing the symbolism with the kind of insight that comes from deep literary scholarship. Mrs. Marsh later told me about Harrison, a promising young scholar who'd come to the house in 1954 to write his dissertation on American Gothic literature. Like Evangeline, he'd been found dead at his work, slumped over the very book I'd discovered. Heart failure again, though he'd been only 28 and in perfect health. He was so close to finishing, Mrs. Marsh said sadly. His research was brilliant, revolutionary, really, such a waste. Each night, I found new evidence of Harrison's presence. Books pulled from shelves, notes appearing in margins, typewriter keys clicking in empty rooms. Sometimes I caught glimpses of him, a tall, thin figure in 1950s clothing, hunched over a typewriter, completely absorbed in his work. As the days passed, I began to understand the pattern. Mrs. Marsh collected them, young, brilliant, ambitious researchers who came to her house seeking inspiration. They found it, all right. They found it so intensely, so completely, that they couldn't tear themselves away from their work. They pushed themselves beyond human limits, driven by some supernatural compulsion to create, to achieve, to finish their masterpieces. And when their bodies finally gave out, their spirits remained, forever pursuing the perfection that had killed them. I met them all eventually. Thomas Ashford, the painter who died in 1967, his final canvas still wet on the easel in the tower room. Margaret Chen, the poet who'd wasted away in 1982, scribbling verses until her hand could no longer hold a pen. David Kowalski, the playwright who'd collapsed over his typewriter in 1995, his final stage directions trailing off mid-sentence. They were all still there, still working, trapped in an endless cycle of creative obsession. And Mrs. Marsh watched over them all, proud as a mother hen, collecting brilliant minds like other people collected butterflies. "They're so happy here," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the marsh in gold and crimson. "They've found their true calling. No distractions, no worldly concerns, just pure, uninterrupted focus on their art." "But they're dead," I said quietly. "Are they?" Mrs. Marsh smiled. "Listen." From the house came the sound of piano music, typewriter keys, the scratch of pen on paper, brushes on canvas. A symphony of creation that never stopped, never paused, never rested. "They're doing what they love," she continued, "what they lived for. Death is such a small price to pay for immortal art." I realized then that I was meant to join them. My research had never been going better. I was making connections, finding insights that would revolutionize the field of Gothic literature. The house was feeding my inspiration, pushing me to work harder, longer, deeper than I ever had before. I barely slept anymore, barely ate. The dissertation consumed my every waking moment, and even my dreams were filled with theories and analysis. I was so close to something groundbreaking, something that would cement my reputation forever. But late one night, as I felt my heart racing from too much caffeine and too little rest, I saw my future clearly. I would be found slumped over my laptop, another victim of Mrs. Marsh's collection, another ghost forever trapped in the pursuit of perfect scholarship. With the last of my willpower, I packed my things and ran. Mrs. Marsh was waiting by my car, that same sharp smile on her weathered face. "Leaving so soon, dear? But you were making such excellent progress." "I'm not going to die for a dissertation," I said, throwing my bags in the trunk. "Oh, but think of the work you could accomplish. Think of the legacy you could leave." As I drove away, I could hear the house behind me. Piano music and typewriter keys and the scratch of pens, all the brilliant minds that had chosen art over life, perfection over existence. I never finished my dissertation. I changed fields entirely, became a high school English teacher instead. It's not the career I'd planned, but I'm alive to have it. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear phantom piano music and wonder what insights I might have discovered if I'd stayed just one more day. The temptation to return is always there, whispering that my greatest work is still waiting for me in that beautiful, terrible house. But I know better now. Some inspiration comes at too high a price, and some collections are never meant to be joined. Mrs. Marsh is still there, still waiting for the next brilliant mind to wander into her web. And in the Victorian house on Kiowa Island, the dead continue their eternal work, forever pursuing the perfection that killed them.